There we go. Back on the air.
Yep.
Coalition Purple. Another crazy week in the world of politics. One thing I was going to mention is so funny because when we get comments and stuff, so many people get focused on the presidential elections, even though we stress we're really not focused on the presidential election, only because any third party candidate likelihood is not really going to make a difference, right, in that particular race. So hence the reason why we keep reiterating the fact about it. A lot of it's about local. Let's focus on local first and go up from there. But at the same time, it's so hard not to at least mention it because there's this has been the wackiest campaign season ever that I recall in a long time.
Yeah, I think the thing about the presidential campaigns too is that it brings the candidates are talking about the issues, and it starts bringing things to light where it's like, okay, the candidates that we have are talking about things in a certain way, or they're refusing to talk about things, and it starts to give you something to look at to sort of contrast with, to say, okay, look, they're saying X and Y, but really, we should be talking more about Z. And, instead of just, the run-of-the-mill platitudes, actually saying things that, have a chance to be impactful. So as far as like running for office, a third party might have a better chance at a local win than at a national level. But as far as creating a banner under which people could gather, talking about the national issues is important because, again, when you do something local, like, let's say we want to fix some of the problems in California. Well, the things that are going on in California are not going to be exactly the same things that are going on in, Alabama. So, talking about local issues is, maybe good for those of us in California, but unless we can talk about national issues that can unify all the states, then, you're not really setting up the big tent to try and draw everyone in. You're talking about more minutia.
So
they're both important.
Yeah, and some things that are federal issues do have probably more generic appeal across things like gerrymandering or the way districts are set up and things like that, because that affects everybody. And there are definitely frameworks they have to live within in terms from a federal standpoint. But for some of the other things, like the one what intrigued me was hearing all the stump speeches going on mainly because of the Democrats finally kind of deciding who their candidate's going to be. That now between the two parties, I don't even know what the identity of either party is anymore, because it's hilarious. Because on one hand, I was reading where Trump's making a big pitch now about, hey, we want to, of course, eliminate more taxes or reduce taxes, but we also want to eliminate taxes on Social Security. These are all things that used to be kind of a Democrat thing as far as eliminating taxes on Social Security, not necessarily eliminating taxes generally, but on Social Security. So, but now he's making a big deal about that. And then, the flip side of it is the Democrats want to expand it all, so instead of not reduce it. And it's like, oh gosh, nowhere are they coming up with practical solutions, because at the end of the day, most likely it's going to drive whatever they do, drive up the debt and deficits.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that the idea about not taxing Social Security, which I frankly agree with. I mean, again, the idea that the government is going to pay money out to you and then take part of it back doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I mean, they could just
give double taxation. I totally agree. It's basically double taxation. Most people have already. I mean, you've already paid in. It's like
the money the money that goes into Social Security is essentially a tax, right? They take it from your paycheck, right, and then they promise to give some of it back to you at a certain rate. And then when they tax you on things, it's like the whole system is not very well thought out in that sense. But I think there's a bigger picture issue that is really important that I don't think gets addressed enough. And I think about it because, I have some elderly relatives, and I know some people who live in, low income housing and things like that. But one of the things where cost really kills you is if you're on a fixed income. And so it's like the cost of everything around you is getting more and more and more, but your income is fixed. So you're not getting any more. And so one of the problems we have, especially in California, and one of the big problems that I think the Democratic Party has, just as far as quality of life for people who would think about voting for Democrats, is that if you ever find yourself in a position where you're dependent on some sort of stable, income, if they're constantly raising costs of everything by, increasing taxes and increasing fees, increasing regulations, doing all these things that make costs go up, well, then you're getting really hammered by that. And to talk about a local issue, Prop 13, one of the problems with taking away Prop 13 would be for anybody who's living on a stable income. Because if you just take Prop 13 away and suddenly you start raising people's property taxes, well, that's another expense that their fixed income can't now account for. So if you were to get rid of Prop 13 in California, you would throw every elderly or poor person that was in any way trying to maintain any kind of property out onto the street, which brings up another two issues. And so now you've got my brain like working in overdrive. So we were talking about federal versus state. One of the things that I think where federal policy really comes in is that the federal government controls so much land in the states. And one of the things you could do is if you had access to some more of that federal land, you might be able to build housing in places where it was more affordable. And if you could build small houses in areas that were affordable, you could give a lot of people an opportunity to participate in home ownership and start increasing their ability to have generational wealth. Because you own a house, you can pass it on to somebody. You own a business, you can pass it on to somebody. Which gets to the next thing, which is one of the things that's constantly complained about when people talk about reparations and other things that the Democrats want to do, which are non-starters and would raise the cost of it and everything, is that when you look at the Black community in the United States, they have so much less generational wealth than other communities do. But And I think that's a real, and it's while I'm against reparations, that's a real legitimate issue. Why does the Black community have so much less wealth? Well, I mean, there's so many historical disadvantages that they face. So
where do we start?
What do we do with that? Well, how about we start creating a situation where we can start getting people in lower income areas, which would disproportionately help the Black population, buying things, not being forced to, into these terrible rent situations or being faced with constantly having to have some kind of subsidy to do something. Because in low income areas, it's almost impossible to generate wealth because everything's so expensive that you can't really invest in it. So you're dependent on subsidies, but the subsidies make the cost of everything go up because everybody else has to pay into it. And so they raise the cost of everything. So you're in this death spiral where it's impossible to generate generational wealth. So there's all these, interconnected layers of things, which we need to start addressing, but we will never be able to address as long as the people in power are comfortable and they know they don't actually have to worry about running for office.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why it comes down to so many of these issues that are they're not very sexy, as far as how people get elected, gerrymandering, all these things. Most people, their eyes glaze over, and I get it. It's not the sexy stuff, or term limits or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, it's those fundamental issues in the way everything is structured right now, including the fact that we only have two parties, basically. That is what's going to make ultimately changes. I think the vast majority of people would agree with. They want everybody to have a fair shot and getting the sport that's realistic and needed and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, if you keep digging yourself into a hole with the deficit and things like that, the fact that we've talked about this before, that the debt is now the biggest problem we have as far as how much money that goes out from a federal standpoint. California is not too far behind after what's gone on in the last few years. We went from this huge surplus to now billions in debt.
Yeah. Yeah, we're in
And so,
a
it's all very complicated, but at the end of the day, it starts with how politicians are incented to do the right thing. And that's, a point of what we talked about a lot last week, but it's one that we just can't give up on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing, when I was young and thinking about third party politics, after a while, decision making for me became simpler and simpler. So I'll just sort of share that sort of experience because, when I was in college, that's when you usually start really thinking about politics. And I was no different than anyone else. I started thinking about things and looking at the issues and thinking to myself about, how could I solve this? How could I solve that? What could I do? What could we change? And as time went on, it came more and more back to the idea that the only way to change anything is to change the government. And there's a saying. How does it go? The laws are only as good as the people that enforce them. So it's like you have all these ideas about, oh, we could have this policy or that policy. We could change this. We could change it. We could do all these different things. But if you have people in office who just aren't going to enforce the laws or don't care about the laws, don't care about the Constitution, don't care about any of that, then it's like you can have all the good ideas in the world, but it won't do anything. So after, years of sort of going around in a circle about what to do, it's sort of like the first step has to be, we got to change the way the government works. If we don't do that, then, I mean, all the good ideas in the world are for naught, And so that's why I'm,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's why I've been so devoted to trying to get ideas about third parties out there because honestly, you can't keep voting for these same two parties and think that anything's going to change. So if you want to change something, it's kind of what there is.
Yeah, no, that's where we're definitely left. The choice we have that we're left with, and again, it's one of those things where how do you intrigue people to kind of get into those fundamental issues?
Yeah,
and that's why I keep trying to think. Okay, if you think of it just like if you're working in your local job, what incents you, right? Money's part of it, but it's usually kind of the happiness quotient and stuff like that about, you may not even get as much money as you'd like, but if you're happy where you're working, that's a big deal. And so I keep trying to apply that theory to politics that, hey, if you're unhappy, and most people are unhappy about it, it's not a case of trying to put a Band-Aid and think, okay, well, this guy, he's been around for a while. I like him, so let's vote for him. It's really trying to find those candidates that are looking at these fundamental issues now that involve how they're incented.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's all how they're incented. And we need to figure out how to incent politicians to do the right thing. And it's, you and I both have hired and fired people over the years. And at the end of the day, you have to have some score, measurement by which if somebody's doing their job or not, right? And we really don't have that. They say, well, the vote is it, the election's that scorecard, but it isn't when the whole thing's rigged to begin with.
Right. And that's the thing, well, I mean, first of all, that's the great hurdle that has to be overcome. I mean, if we've gone so far down the rabbit hole that the elections are too rigged that no one can actually compete, then, I mean, we're basically screwed. And so this podcast, I think, sort of comes from a place of assuming that it is still possible to get other people elected in other positions. But I think the one great thing about a third party, and this was one of the early things that I thought about too, is that if you run on a message of we're going to change the political structure, and you can start to get people elected on that, people come to you and support you, then you are incentivized for change because the people won't continue voting for you if you don't change anything. But when you have parties that are basically just promising you to do the same things they've already done and they get elected, well, then of course there's no incentive for them to change anything. They're winning by doing the same things that they've always done. So by creating something new, you create an opportunity for there to be a party that actually, profits from changing things as opposed to profits from keeping things exactly the same as they've always been. So,
and that can apply pretty much to any level, right? So at the
Yeah,
state
absolutely.
level, if you're exhausted, like I think a lot of people are over, you know, gas taxes. Let's just throw one out there. It's like
Yeah, it's
how
one
can
of many.
California have how can California have the highest gas taxes basically anywhere, and we still have roads falling apart? You
Yeah,
know, so there's got to be somehow we got to at the state level incent politicians to try and figure out another better, different way besides raising taxes
yeah,
to solve the traffic issues we have,
yeah,
and not only traffic issues, but just general transportation issues. And but it's not that. It's just okay. We just need to spend more money, and that's
yeah.
it's like
But the thing is, I think if
wait,
you start when you start to expose the thinking behind the whole "we just need to spend more money" thing too, I think it's revealing, and I hope people start to pay attention to it more. Basically, every problem in California follows the same sort of like circular pattern. The politicians give money to somebody who gives money back to their campaign so that they can spend money to get elected to spend money on the person. So it's like we're talking about gas taxes. Like gas taxes are supposed to fix the roads, but really what gas taxes do is enrich companies are part of the road construction cabal. And so the money goes to those companies, and they get a ton of money, and then they give that money back to donations to the politicians, and then it
yeah,
just goes around and around and around. And you can look at it for like literally anything. One of the things that they've talked about recently is that we had I can't remember what the bill here in California was. It was supposed to spend some enormous amount of money to help the homeless situation, but
right.
instead of actually doing anything about the homeless situation, we've just really enriched a lot of companies that make a lot of money, you know, that the state then buys up to give to homeless people, like tents or water bottles or whatever it is that at this
Whatever.
moment in
Yeah.
time that they're giving them. And so those companies make an enormous amount of money, but the real problem is that they have no incentive, as you were talking about incentives, have no incentive to actually do anything about homelessness, because their whole business model is built around the
No.
government buying their stuff to give to the homeless people so that they can keep making an enormous amount of money. And then they turn around and fund the campaigns of the politicians who want to give them money to give things to the homeless people, and it goes around and around and around and around. And it's like, until you can throw a monkey wrench into that system, until you can get somebody in there and says, we're not gonna have this infinite pool of money that the government thinks it has to just enrich all these different little people, well, then you're just going to keep getting these same things over and over again.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's the classic tactics driving the strategy versus the other way around. What
Yeah,
is the strategy to actually achieve this goal of getting people off the streets in a pragmatic way? And that's just kind of gone out the window. It's to your point. It's like, no, let's create a program where we build a bunch of tiny homes. Okay. So where are you going to put these tiny homes? Well, we haven't figured that part out yet. I mean, that's literally one of the things that's going on. They had a huge program to build tiny homes, and they have all this money, and they don't know they got the homes, tiny homes built, but they have no
yeah,
place to take them.
yeah.
It's
And that's
like,
the thing. I
it's
think
like it.
I was going to say, I think there are a lot of good ideas out
Good.
there, but we can't execute the good ideas or make the good ideas happen because everything is locked down in the fundamental corruption of the government that we're faced with. So before anything else happens, before we can get
Yeah.
anywhere, it's like you have to change the way the government works. You have to change the way elections happen. You have to change any number of things. But until you can get competition back into governance, everything else is going to be really hard to come
Right.
by.
Yeah. I mean, we're back to your original point. I mean, we're kind of using California as some examples there, but the same situation happens pretty much in every state. It might be different issues,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's whatever farm subsidies in,
Yeah, yeah.
Indiana or something. I don't know, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But so they each all have their own little turfdoms that they fight over and create these industries in essence. And, and the only thing that I've ever thought about that could help start to move that needle, going back to a third party, is basically say, hey, if we can get enough people to say, hey, and really, I think a lot of it does come around finances. Um, and for whatever your state representative, your state senator, whatever, not even at the federal level, say, hey, we'll support you, but if you don't make any headway in 3 terms or 2 terms or whatever,
Yeah.
we're not voting for you again,
Yeah.
right? And that's where literally a few thousand people within a district can have that. You don't even need a party at that point. You just need enough people to say, because a lot of these state races for like local reps going up to the state, or let alone city council or something like that, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of, maybe a few thousand votes separate them.
Yep.
It doesn't take much. And you just need to get enough people that are committed to, hey, we're not going to vote for stuff unless there's a real plan of attack, and making more sense of this to try and break up this phenomenon that's been created over all the politics over the years.
Well, that's the thing, as I say, I think one of the great problems that, I have, even when I'm thinking about any kind of thing about having to do with third parties or politics or anything else, is there's a whole chicken in the egg thing. It's like, okay, it's too difficult to do something national, so you want to do something that's, local. But how do you get local people organized around an idea as opposed to them just being, essentially anarchy? I mean, if there's no leadership to help bring people together to sort of get, a coalition, then maybe you get a one-off here and there where some independent wins, but that independent person could be supporting anything about anything. So they end up being a flash in the pan, and so it's a difficult thing. I mean, with this we've been talking today sort of about like the difficult reality of where we are, and I think it is a difficult reality, but it's like if you had an organization that was dedicated to these good ideas, and you could actually seek out candidates and hope and maybe facilitate those candidates from all over the country coming together, even if they are local candidates. A few people in these states and that thing, blah blah. But once they start coming together, then you've coalesced a group of people that can work together for ideas and then move those ideas up the ladder. But you have to have a set of ideas that people are willing to at least work together with.
Right.
And I think that's where the party comes in. And I honestly think that's where this podcast comes in, because, you and I, it would be nice to say that we're going to just make this party happen and everyone's going to join. But I think a lot of it is just, you got to have people putting out ideas out there. And then, hopefully maybe people can start to coalesce around some of those ideas. And, it's got to be us. It's got to be other people. It's going to have to be some money out there somewhere. And, it's a lot of things. But we're here to hopefully maybe have a few good ideas, maybe get some people willing to at least take the jump into trying something different, and hopefully maybe moving something forward. But I mean, at that point, this is kind of what you can do right now.
Right. Well, I'm always reminded of, remember, gosh, probably been 20, 25 years ago when the GOP came out with their contract for America. Do you remember that? And it's like, I don't know, 10 or so things that they thought, a lot of them I didn't necessarily agree with. But what was interesting about it was a tangible thing that people could get their head around.
Absolutely.
Whether you agreed with it or not.
Yeah.
Kind of worked as that kind of a vehicle. And so that's what at some kind of local level, come up with something similar to that. Hey, here's 3 things that we really believe politicians should be getting behind over the next 10 years to get these fundamental changes. Because I think if it's too abstract, people they're interested, but they don't know how to do anything. So it's like, hey, here's 3 or 4 things that we think will fundamentally change how government works for the benefit of the vast majority of people. And make sure you communicate to whoever you think is the best person for the job each election. Say, hey, I'm voting for you on the premise that you're going to push for these things. In a few years, there's no progress. We're going to change horses.
All right. Well, I got one for you then. So we in California have the ballot process. My brain is just, it's going in too many directions at once now. But why not create a ballot measure? And this is just me, off the top of my head. We say that if you're a company and you're getting money from the government to do something, if you can't show demonstrable process on whatever the something is, the big picture something that you're supposed to be doing, like improving, homelessness situation, then your contract is automatically canceled. You can never regain that contract. And then they have to go look for some other contractor to stop this endless loop of where it's solely to the benefit of the company to make sure they never solve the problem that they're being contracted to solve. And if we pass something like in California, the Responsible Contracting Act, we could get those infinite loops maybe starting to slow down, because again, and this is another one of the fundamental differences between government versus private business. Government just looks at money as an infinite pool of resources that they can just keep dishing out forever, regardless of what deleterious effects that has on the economy and the population in general. But there has to be, like, if the government is going to have this money and they're going to give it to people, they need to be able to demonstrate that they are making results. Otherwise, those contracts should automatically be canceled.
Yeah. Or do some kind of version of that, kind of like Proposition 13 has done in a way that, because it was simplistic in how it was done. And it sort of becomes just sort of part of the fabric of how things get done. I mean, I know a lot of people think it's holds the state back, but I've found it made a whole lot of sense, because it's like, hey, if you're doing the right thing and you're working hard, you're not going to get penalized for, saving and staying in one place and helping build a community. You're incented to do that because your taxes aren't going to go up, right?
Right.
And so that theory seems like, how do you make something like that apply? And maybe it is through some kind of ballot measure like you're talking about. So it becomes just sort of a natural thing, not just creating another bureaucracy.
Right.
I went to a meeting yesterday on some permitting stuff, and it was like a 2-hour meeting. It's like, if it takes a 2-hour meeting to explain a permit process, therein lies trouble right there.
Exactly.
Yep. I mean, it should be almost automatic and not, and Prop 13's kind of done that in a way. It's just made it very simple. Hey, you buy a place and you stay in it, you're good. I mean, that's as complicated as it is, right?
Yeah.
And to the extent that you can do that in the contracting world in some way, shape, or form with that mentality, is, ultimately be a benefit to everybody.
Yeah. Because I mean, the ultimate example in California is the bullet train. So, I mean, theoretically, the idea of the bullet train is that it's supposed to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And I don't know how long it's been going on, but we've spent billions and billions of dollars on it, and it has made no discernible progress.
Yeah.
So the point is that at this point, those contracts should have automatically been canceled, and all the scamsters that are trying to sell us railroad tracks should never be able to compete for those contracts again. They should be frozen out. And if you had that situation, they would be incentivized to actually build the damn train. Not that I think building the train at all is a particularly good idea, but at least at the end of the day, you'd get a train. That'd be something, as opposed to the nothing which we have currently. And so, as I say, there's so many things that the government spends money on and contracts out for. And like one of the other things you're talking about all the regulations in California, how difficult it is to do anything. Well, more part of that legislation about contracting is if the contractors come back and say, look, the reason that we haven't made progress is because you keep hitting us with regulations that we can't manage to get through. Then maybe there should be an automatic review of the regulatory state that's contained in that as well. It's like, okay, well, no progress has been made, so we're canceling all your contracts. Nope, sorry, we're taking you to court because the reason we couldn't fulfill the contract is because the regulations on us is so ridiculous. And then you get that into the review process, and it starts thinking, okay, so yeah, we need to do something about these regulations so that people can actually get things done that they're supposed to get done, as opposed to just throwing money at it, throwing money
Yeah.
at it, throwing at it, throwing money at it, and never doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, we say that even on the federal level too. It happens at
Mm-hmm.
all levels.
Right.
But, we start out with these good, I think, really good premises on so many things. I mean, the Constitution was a really good idea,
Yeah.
right? So, but when it was written, we were obviously at a different point in our progress and culture and society and all that. And the fact that it's so hard to make what would seemingly be fundamental, easy changes is the flaw in the whole thing. And so we just keep putting Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid. And that happens at a lot of levels. And, and again, I don't know what the answer is on that other than somehow cleaning the slate and start over a little bit. But
Yeah.
you got a chance of doing that with some third party approach where you just start chipping away at some of these fundamental issues that are going to just keep, fueling the same kind of bureaucracy that's gone on forever.
Yeah, well, that's what I say, and again, it always, as I say, for all the years I've been thinking about that, you have to change, you have to swap out the people that are in charge for people who are actually willing to work at something that it is meaningful, and I think basically, I mean, I have pretty strong views about how things are actually run. I would say there are basically two ways to really get things moving. You have to either have a third party or you have to completely reform one of the other two parties. And, I don't see any movement
Which
on the
isn't
two
going to happen.
parties that want to reform themselves. So that leaves you with a third party option.
No.
Yeah, I did want to say one thing about the Constitution because, I have also pretty strong opinions about that. I think the issue with the Constitution is not so much that it needs to be tinkered with. It's that, of course, no document that's 200 years old could have anticipated all the changes in the
Right.
world that have taken place. The ideas in the Constitution and the system that it sets up that we shouldn't tinker with, but we also should be accepting of the fact that there may be
Right.
things that it
No,
doesn't particularly address, and then that's what new legislation, new laws, and the Supreme Court are for. And so you just have to be careful about how you're looking at things because, like, one thing that's going on right now with Biden and Harris is they're working on, I guess they're calling it an update of Title IX, which is outrageous,
mm-hmm.
just totally outrageous. Why they would think that they're in any way capable of even touching or rethinking Title IX is just, it's abysmal. And so it's like when you have a really great piece of legislation like the Constitution, like Title IX, you need to hold that sacrosanct and be like, this was written for a really good reason in a really good way, and it has been really successful and done really great things. And then when people come along and try and tamper with it, you need to be saying, no, 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 no. You can't tamper with that. You want to make a new law and have people look at it and vote on it? Okay. But you do not touch Title IX.
Right. Yep. Yeah. No. And I mean, it does get complicated because it's like a lot of the civil rights stuff that's been changed over the years, right?
Yeah.
Other civil rights stuff that's been changed over the years, and some of it's with good intent. I mean, most of it, all of it, as far as I know, was passed with good intentions, but
Yeah.
then things do evolve, and so we're always working in the gray area of all these things, which makes it all the more challenging.
Yeah.
But anyways, well, we better start to wrap this up. But good discussion, and we just got to keep thinking about how we can make some of these fundamental things really exciting. Unfortunately, we
now
deal
there
with
is a challenge.
That's well, and that's the reality of trying to get enough people excited about stuff. They get animated when something happens, like the whole abortion thing that just happened,
Yeah.
or some other event happens dealing with some other Supreme Court decision, whatever the case may be, and I'll get animated for a few weeks, maybe a month or two, and then it just sort of drifts away. So when it comes to some of these other things that are just chronic issues that drive every decision that's going on kind of invisibly. Man, how do you get people enthusiastic about looking at some of those things?
Yeah.
And I kind of always look at those kinds of things as a marketing problem, because that's kind of my world. And it's like, it's a tough one, man, to get people without pandering or making up stuff just to get them riled up. And,
Yeah.
It's got to be genuine for it to ever be effective.
I would just add this one last thing before we call it a day, and that is that part of the solution to that is if you can get the right people in the office, then the way our system is supposed to work is that those people in office then can consider those things while everybody else switches gears to, a million other things. So you have to have people that are willing you can elect, that have good ideas and are willing to stay the course. And so, third party.
Yep. There you go. Keeps coming back to that.
Yep.
All right. Well, we'll hang it up there for now, and we'll hit it again next week.
Yep. See you next week.